the position as the chief librarian at Lander College for Women at Truro College. He is a world-renowned scholar who has written over 18 books, published many papers, and gave presentations on various topics, such as the history of the Jewish libraries and classification systems, the Dead Sea Scroll Library, and ethical halachic concerns on the online environment, just to name a few. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing Dr. David Levy talk about organizations of the Judaic calendar. So without further ado, with great pride and pleasure, I'd like to introduce to our congregants, let's welcome him, Dr. David Levy. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Toda Rabah Leah Hartman, for your warm welcome.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank David Salome for hosting and helping with the sharing of the slides and technical aspects of the presentation, of which there's a PowerPoint that I hope everybody will enjoy. And of course, Rabbi Weisblum, who I've known for about 15 years, and who I'm indebted to as a mentor and have great respect. I appreciate Rabbi Weisblum inviting me to offer this riff on the organization of the Jewish calendar this evening. I thought I'd begin with a little meditation from Kohelet, Timely Torah. We're moving into the Yamim Noraim. And of course, as we say in the davening and the Machzor and the Tanakh Tokef, it's written on Rosh Hashana, sealed on Yom Kippur. The Malachim deliver the shiksal, or the fate of one's yearly endeavors for the year, to Hashem's archive on Hoshana Rabbah. And so Sukkot is a part of this structure, which is one of the most philosophic holidays. We go out from our constructed abodes and into the Sach, the Sukkah, where we see the heavenly bodies. And as Tehillim notes, Ki areh shemecha ma'aseh etzbetecha yorech v'chol chavim asher kananta ma'enosh ketizkerenu u'ben adam ketifkedenu. So just imagine in Psalm 8, David HaMelech's looking up at the stars. There's no pollution, there's no streetlights in ancient Israel. And he's filled with wonder. And it's really from the movement of the motion of the heavenly bodies that Rambam, Maimonides, 1135 to 1204, notes that time comes into being, as we know, on one dimension in Olam Hazeh, in this world, and from the circulation of the seasons. And so there are cultures that are very in tune with time and nature, that don't even have a word for time. The anthropologist Pritchard mentions the Newer tribe in Australia don't have a word for time, and yet they migrate their flocks and are very aware of the rising and setting of the sun. Post Copernicus, we know we live in a heliocentric universe, but they're very much in tune with natural time and biological clocks, and have an intuitive sense of time. Judaism has a lot of words for time. The three main words are Zaman, Moed, and Et, and they all mean different things. And as I wanted to make this timely Torah, I want to recall that we'll be reading on Sukkot, the very famous chapter 3 of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, that there's a time for this and a time for that. L'kol Zaman, ve'et l'kol chafetz tachat hashamayim, et laledet ve'et lamut, et l'ta'at ve'et la'kor natua, eight laharog ve'eight leropo, eight lefarotz ve'eight levanot. So I won't mention all of the pasukim, but they culminate in the last one, that there's a time for war and a time for peace. So there's this notion of appropriate times for things. And Sukkot is a time to wonder about time. And calendars are, some epistemologists might say, man-made systems that measure time. But yet there's a very important scholar named Sacha who argues that there's something unique about the Jewish calendar. It's eternality. People have referred to the Hebrew language as eternal, Hashem is eternal, the land of Israel is eternal, the Jewish people are eternal people. And this person, Sacha Stern, has written wonderful books about time and the calendar. This happens to be one of them, The Calendar and Community. In his book, Time and Process in Ancient Judaism, he distinguishes that the Jews and the Hebrews really have a unique sense of time, because Hashem by definition is eternal, is without limit, not finite. That is, he breaks every bound, limit, boundary, frame that one could attempt to put him in. That would be idolatry, putting him in a box. So he's transcendent. He's outside of time, and yet he creates time from the very beginning of Bereshit. And we, as Jews, we want to dwell eternally in time, or poetically in time. And the rabbis do that by the calendar and the hagim that circulate in the calendar. The first Rashi on the Torah is that Hashem creates time itself. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz, va'aretz hayata tohu vohu v'hoshech al pnei tachom ruach Elokim rachet al pnei hamayim. And Rashi comments, in the beginning, Rabbi Isaac, and of course Rashi's rabbi, his name is Isaac, the Torah, which is the law book of Israel, should have commenced with the verse, "This month shall be unto you the first of months," which is the first commandment given to Israel. What is the reason? Then that it commences with the account of the creation. Because of the thought expressed in the text, he declared to his people the strength of his works. He gave an account of the work of creation in order that he might give them the heritage of the nations. That Hashem gave us a little sliver of real estate in the Middle East. It's called Eretz Yisrael. It's a holy land. And yet the text begins with the creation of the world, Maaseh Bereshit. Because Rashi's raising a question that why didn't it begin in Nisan, when we recall the laws of preparing for Pesach? And of course, for the BDS movement or any anti-Zionists who might challenge Jews' right that was promised to Avram and promised in the very beginning of beginnings to the land of Israel, Hashem created time itself, like a musician almost, who creates time when he composes a piece in the symphony of creation, and therefore has endowed and given as a legacy to the Jewish people this little real estate in the land of Israel known as Eretz Yisrael. And we want to dwell poetically in time throughout the year by observing all the Hagim, by davening in the morning, Shacharit, which goes back to the Korbanot, Mincha, which goes associated with Yitzhak, also referring to the Mincha offering in the Beit HaMikdash, and Mariv, corresponding to Yaakov, again, referring to the Beit HaMikdash. And in fact, in the Beit HaMikdash, there was a sundial that measured time of the shadow. So there was a consciousness of at that time, what was thought was the progression of the sun across the heavens. In Greek mythology, that it was pulled by a chariot, so to speak. But the Jews are very different than the Greeks in their notions of time. The word in Greek to spend time is chronos diatribin. The Jews want to dwell poetically in time. So how do we do that? We do that by observing the Hagim and Shabbos, which is the most frequent holiday every seventh day. So I'm going to go into the PowerPoint now. The 5th century calendar of the elephantine Jewish community in Egypt is a very early calendar. But even earlier than this calendar in Egypt, in the 5th century of the Jewish community there, is a calendar called the Gezer calendar. And the Gezer calendar is from about the 10th century. People put it either in the time of Shlomo HaMelech or even in the time of the Shoftim, of which, Boaz is one of the judges, and Mordecai, according to the rabbinic ideas of, and of course, Shimshon, of the judges. And this calendar really was a schoolboy's tablet or blackboard, where there's a time for planting, and there's a time for reaping, and there's a time for harvesting. It is an agricultural calendar, of which ancient Israel really understood better than most nations that Hashem is the one who gives us our food, and the food is grown. So even with ki savo, vaya ki tavo el haaretz asher Hashem elokach noten lecha nachla, where we recite this confession over the Bikurim on around Shavuos time, we give thanks that Hashem has offered these agricultural products, the 7 products of Israel, and we offer them to the Beit HaMikdash. And so to be in touch with the land, to not be alienated from the land, is so fundamental to Jewish environmental ethics. And I have a PowerPoint and a link just on Jewish environmental ethics in the Jewish ethics section of the Torah Library's ethics library guides. I won't say much more about that, but in ancient Israel, they were very much in tune and not alienated from the land. Then the early Zionists wanted to recapture that to go and drain swamps, to plant oranges. Israel is one of the largest exporters of tulips, even more than Amsterdam and Holland. The Israelis invented the black tulips. I think it was a Dr. Perlmutter. And the cherry tomato. Tomatoes are from South America, but the little ones, the Israelis engineered. And they are condensing dew and growing in very arid desert conditions, cucumbers and all sorts of flowers and so forth. Now, the ancient Egyptian calendar was full of kishuf, magic. It was thought that theurgy or acts of divination could control time. And that's very foreign to Judaism. That's Avodah Zarah. And there's a whole tractate in the Talmud that deals with all sorts of civilizations that have tried to put Hashem in a box and control time and control Hashem. But Rambam makes it quite clear that that is very foreign to the Jewish notion, because it lends itself to a capricious universe, a universe of accident, a universe where a malicious force, somebody saying hocus pocus and incantations and so forth, can affect theurgically events in history or what happens to human beings. And that Rambam, in a public open position, was a rationalist, and he felt it was very dangerous to go to, let's say, Egyptian magic, which definitely influenced the Greek tradition, as a recent book, Pulling Down the Moon, which I'm reviewing for Classical World, shows, was very much a part of the Greek and Roman cultures that trickled down from Egyptian and Babylonian aspects of magic. So the Egyptian calendar is filled with magical aspects that Rambam rejects. Although the Rambam, interestingly, was an avid reader of works in Avodah Zarah, like Nabatean agriculture, where it was thought that mixing milk and meat would influence the crop plentitude for the upcoming year. So the Rambam is different than many rabbis. He holds that mixing milk and meat, you won't be zapped, because it's unhealthy or so forth. That we distance ourselves from those pagan Canaanites who did that and were idolaters, because we want to distance ourselves. So let's go to the next slide. Thank you. Number 5, the ancient Hindu tradition. I have great respect for Hindu religion. And they, of course, have their own calendar. Yet they have elements of Zoroastrianism, which is a Persian religion, that creep into the Hindu religion, which is largely in India, which are very foreign to Judaism. So in the Mishnah, if somebody says, Modim, Modim, we give thanks, the rabbis say they should be silenced, that they believe in a good power and a bad power. And we certainly don't believe in cremation as the Hindus do. But it's a very fascinating calendar, and I have immense respect for Hindu friends who have had a big impact on my life, and I have great respect for that culture. Could we go to slide number 6, please? So the ancient Chinese calendar, a lot could be said about that. The traditional Chinese calendar was developed about 771 to 476 during the spring and the autumn period of the Eastern Zhou dynasty. Before Zhou dynasty, solar calendars were used. One version of the solar calendar is the 5 elements calendar, which you see there from Wu Xing. I have a sister who did a PhD in ancient Mandarin Chinese, wrote a dissertation on the Confucian Analects, Lao Tzu and Menashius. And wow, it's a wonderful culture. They have, I wouldn't call it ancestor worship, but they have some similarities, great respect that Judaism also places in rising before the people with white hair and people with experience, the elders. There's great respect. The opening is of the Confucian Annex, is that person not a person of complete virtue who pursues wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, although others take no note of them. And the calendar of the Chinese ancient Confucian culture reflects a lot of these noble ideas, which of course Mao Zedong wanted to get rid of, with the aristocrats of Confucian culture and the Cultural Revolution. Could we go to the next slide, please, number 7? So the ancient biblical calendar, really in Tehillim, for instance, which I cited Psalm number 8 with David HaMelech wondering and seeing the heavenly bodies, which create our notion of time through motion, what we know today as orbits in modern science, which generates the seasons. In antiquity, it was thought that there were 7 planets. We know there's Pluto now, and they found another one. But let's say in the davening of the Vilna Gaon comments on the Kaladon, all 7 planets are mentioned, if you notice. Or the menorah has 7 branches. So it's a machlochet between the Sadukim and the Perushim, whether the menorah during the Hagim, including Sukkot, has to be teveled in a mikveh. This is a halachic or legal question. The Perushim said yes, the Sadukim said no. Why did the Sadukim say no, the Sadducees? Because the menorah was supernatural, and its 7 branches referred to the 7 planets, which their motion creates time. And the proof for motion is one of the proofs for the existence of Hashem for Rambam, as well as the ontological proof, as well as intelligent design, we would call it today, and the proof that Hashem is the thought beyond which thought cannot proceed is even there. And Rav Sacha Gaon and Rambam and Rav Bachim Baguda give numerous different ways of, according to the limits of the human intellect, of proving the existence of Hashem's eternality, who created time and beyond time. The next slide, the days in Tehillim are not from
Tehillim meaning
in
Psalms.
Babylon. Yeah, excuse me?
Tehillim meaning Psalms.
Yes, Psalms referred to the days as Yom Rishon, that would be Sunday, and Yom Sheni, Monday, Yom Shlishi, Tuesday, Yom Revi'i, Wednesday, Yom Chamishi, Thursday, and Yom Shishi, Friday. Not sure why this chart doesn't put Yom HaShabbat. They go back to Yom Rishon. It's a full cycle, complete circle there. The 7-day calendar, resting on the Sabbath day, it's very fundamental to the opening of Breshit. And we know that the day begins in the Jewish calendar because of 2 proof texts from Vayi Erev, Vayi Boker, Yom Echad, from the first paragraph of Breshit, and also the paragraph in the
Vayi Erev, Vayi Boker, meaning it was night and it was day.
Yes,
one day.
sorry.
So it means that's the way that the Torah described the beginning of creation. It was start at night, Vayi Erev, it's the evening, Vayi Boker, it's a morning. What Dr. Levy tried to say that there are Prushim meaning Pharisees, and it was a Tzedukim. And Tzedukim was a Karaite, and Tzedukim that interpreted text literally, and there are those that go by the figurative understanding. So with that said, Vayi Erev, Vayi Boker, it was night, it was day, meaning if you look at lighting candles before Shabbat and holidays, we always start in the evening. It was based on that notion that in the Torah, we start at night first, Vayi Erev, and then Vayi Boker. Sorry.
No problem. I thank you for clarifying, Rabbi. Thank you. Toda Rabbah. And to go back to the menorah, which I evoked, it has 7 branches corresponding to the 7 planets, the Sadukim noted. So they said it didn't need to be teveled or put in a mikveh after the Hagim, when the hoi polloi came in closer proximity with the menorah. The fact is, there were 12 menorot in the first Beit HaMikdash, the first temple. The one you see on the Arch of Titus is shaped with, half a semicircle. But Rambam holds the menorah might have been straight, like Chabad holds, as he doodled that in a manuscript in the Bodleian Library. But the point is, A late midrash called Midrash Tadshe, a genre of rabbinic exegesis, holds the position of the Sadukim, interestingly enough, that the menorah is actually a supernatural kind of lightning rod, so to speak, or a radio that receives signals. Sounds a little hocus pocus, California flaky, but you have to see the Midrash Tadshe pulling up the opinion of the Sadukim, 6 or 7 generations before. So these ideas recycle. But in Psalms, they don't refer to the Babylonian months, of Nisan, in which Pesach falls, Tishrei, in which we're coming up with Rosh Hashana. There have been archaeological excavations of the trumpeting place inscription on Har Bayit. This one dates to the Second Temple. And the shofar was sounded before Shabbos as a warning that Shabbos was approaching. And there are halakhic debates: when does nightfall begin? Is it when the sun is at the horizon, or when the sun is under the horizon? That's very complicated halakhic discussion. I won't go into that now, but there were warning signals, and even today in Brooklyn or in Monsey or in Mea Sharim, you will hear sirens go that note the approaching of Shabbos. But in antiquity, in the Second Temple, and even before, the shofar was blown. Rav Sacha Gaon gives, I think, 7 or 8 reasons why the shofar is blown: to pack up camp. The Rambam's classic example is to wake us up from our spiritual slumbers that we do teshuvah. But this inscription says every Rosh Chodesh blow on the shofar. And this is a very wonderful archaeological excavated finding. And if you're interested in musical instruments in the Tanakh, I recommend highly the work of Saul Feinsinger, who compares the Hebrew names for instruments like Vatikach Miriam Neviah Chod Aaron et Taf Biyada V'Tetzena Kol Hashim Achareka B'Tubim U'Machalot, that she took a tambourine. But did you know that the Ladino translation in Spanish in Hebrew characters translates tough as a castanet? Or the kinnor, the harp that King David played, was no more than 2 or 3 cubits long. We know that from First Temple excavations, dug up a harp. And yet, after the Maccabees and the following of the Hasmoneans, who invited the Romans in, this instrument called a kinnor goes large in size, about the size of a Celtic harp. The pitch, the tone, the cadence is totally changed. So what Feinsinger does in this analysis of all the musical instruments mentioned in the Tanakh, and quite a few in Psalm 150, he shows how they change in tone, pitch, and melody and cadence over time in different languages. In the Septuagint in Greek, in the Latin, in the Vulgate, or the Tafsir in Arabic. Rav Sacha Gaon translated the Hebrew text of the Tanakh to Arabic, and in the Peshitta, Syriac translation, and even up to German translation, die Heilige Schrift in ihrer Bedeutung of Morten Bruber and Rosenzweig, in which have been preceded by Mendelssohn's Bior. Now, this is the Dead Sea Scroll calendar, which was based on the Book of Jubilees, which finds itself in the Catholic's canon. The Book of Jubilees does, along with the Book of Maccabees, for that matter. There's a debate whether Rambam considers that one of the Sefer HaChitzonim, one of the outside books, or did some rabbis hold it was Ben Sira. There are different debates about that. But whatever it is, this ascetic sect, the Essenes most likely, living in Qumran, a very desert area near En Gedi, authored many works, and they followed a solar calendar. And there's a very famous incident in the Damascus documents, one of their documents, where the Kohen Gadol traveled to the Essene community in Qumran on the day of reckoning that the Essenes thought Yom Kippur fell, but according to the Perushim, the rabbis, it was not mitama, was not the same. You have an analogous type of experience, lahavdil, different, in the Talmud, where I think Rabbi Yeshua submits to the calendrical reconciliation of the day of Yom Kippur falling as Rabban Gamliel legislated it. And then Rosh Hashana, the tractate in the Talmud that has many discussions about the new year, when the world was created, the birthday of the world, Rabban Gamliel had a little attic in Yerushalayim, and he would have the witnesses for the new moon. Did you see it full? Malay. Did you see it chatzi, half? Or did you see it ibor, pregnant? And just a note on this, the present Jewish calendar is lunisolar, but the lunar calendar was based on the testimony of people seeing the full moon. And the Samaritans would throw things off by lighting bonfires to mix that up, according to the Rosh Hashana. The conjunction of the moon with the sun is the point in time at which the moon is directly between the earth and the sun, but not in the same plane, and is thus invisible. This is known as the molad, or birth, from the word yalad, to give birth. The mean synodic month, or lunation, is 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 3 1/3 seconds, which are 793 halakim. In the Jewish system, the hour is divided into 1,080 parts, each of which is 3 1/3 seconds. The solar year, you know, is 365 days, 48 minutes, and 46 seconds, which means that the solar calendar exceeds the lunar one 12 months by about 11 days. The cycles of 12 lunar months must therefore be adjusted to the solar year. And the way they do this, have you ever wondered, why do we have some years that have two Adar, Adar 1 and Adar 2? So a later slide, which we're not, well, I'll get to later, Hillel II fixed the Jewish calendar to deal with this situation, because it's very important to observe Pesach in the spring. It's called the festival of Aviv, for that matter. And you don't want to be observing Purim you know, at the wrong time in the seasons. So the Dead Sea Scroll calendar I could talk about for days and years and many seminars. It's a wonderful, it's a mystical calendar. There are 7, the songs of the Sabbath sacrifices. The Dead Sea Scroll Essene community would offer sacrifices at the very moment that the korbanot were, they would sing songs rather, that the korbanot were being offered in the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. And much more could be said about that. I referred you to one of my papers that's linked on the PowerPoint if you're interested in Dead Sea Scroll work. I had the good fortune of studying under Rabbi Joseph Baumgarten, who was the world's expert on the halachic or legal aspects of the Dead Sea Scrolls before Lawrence Schiffman. I would consider myself incredibly blessed to have learned tremendously from him. The 3rd century Dura Europas synagogue. Wow, this is incredible. If you like mosaics, some of the most incredible mosaics are from them. They had, on the left here, you see the calendar that they followed, which was a lunar calendar. Dura Europas is in Syria. The place was excavated, I think, in around 1932, and they found incredible mosaics. This inscription is about 244 CE. You can see in this mosaic, of which there are many, you have Bacha, Pharaoh's daughter, retrieving Moshe in the Nile, with Miriam looking on, making sure her brother was safe. Interestingly, the Septuagint goes on a midrash. It was, according to some opinion, a sad day in Jewish history when 70 elders locked in different rooms came with the same translation in Greek from the Hebrew text. But interestingly, the Septuagint is filled with midrashic knowledge. You know, in the exoteric text of Shemot, we learn that I think Pharaoh's daughter, was it sent out her maidens or sent out her hand? But the Septuagint goes on the midrash that she sent out her maidens. Now, 6th century Beit Alpha. Wow, this is absolutely extraordinary. Does anybody recognize what this is? This is the zodiac. Beit Alpha is in Israel. It's now in the slopes of the Gilboa Mountains near Beit Shean. The Beit Alpha Synagogue is in the national park and managed by the Israel Nature and Parks Authority. What you have here in this slide is the months of the Hebrew calendar surrounding the Merkava. Now, of course, we have a prohibition, lo aseh l'chapesel, do not make a sculptured image. This is not a sculptured image. This is a mosaic, 2-dimensional. But it says a lot about what time is.
You have 15 minutes left.
14 minutes. So you have, according to Zohar Vat Hanan, the first wheel in the Merkava, or the chariot of God, Hashem, is Abraham as the man, brought ethical monotheism to the world. Yitzhak as an lion in the second wheel of the chariot. The third wheel is Yaakov as an ox or shore, and David HaMelech as an eagle. And there's a debate in the Talmud, actually, way before the Zohar. Rabbi Lakish says that the fourth wheel should be David HaMelech, because he had a vision of the whole. And because you would think it would be Yosef after the Yavot. But here we have in Israel, Zippori, one of my favorite places. Zippori means a bird. The place is on a little mountain, and it gets the breeze. So Rabbi Yehuda Nazi, who codified the Mishnah about 210 CE, because he lived in a time of crisis and he believed that the oral law, which should not be written down, had to be written down so it not be forgotten based on the pasuk in Psalms, that he must break the law in order to save the law. That's a tradition that you see in Rambam, Maimonides. He writes down in the Guide for the Perplexed, the Sefer Mora Nevuchim, the Dalat al-Arin in Arabic, the Guide des Gegorian in French, secrets of the doings of the chariot and the doings of creation, in order to save these secrets lest they be forgotten. So in this previous slide, number 14, if we can go back, we see that you have in Zippori, again, the motif of the Merkava, God's chariot, surrounded by the zodiac, the Hebrew months. You find that in the Bialystoker Shul here in New York City. The zodiac is around the lintel of the shul, and the Torah is read in the middle, that representing the Merkava, so to speak, of Hashem's throne and chariot. The tradition goes back, of course, to Eliyahu and Avi, Elijah the prophet, who went up in a fiery chariot. It's echoed in Haftarah Yitro of Yeshayahu, Isaiah, B'shnat Mot Uziyahu Amalek Ve'ared Adoni Yoshev Al Kisei Ram Ben Nisa. Yeshayahu was a city prophet in Jerusalem, sees Hashem on a throne in the Beit HaMikdash. And then Yehezkel, after the Babylonian exile in 586, on the river Chabar, sees the reflection of the chariot in the river Chabar, which Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, Guide for the Perplexed, notes if you reverse the letters, it spells to bless, to ride, and cherub, and makes a lot out of that. I refer you to the Guide for the Perplexed if you'd like to know why Rambam does that. Here's an ancient Greek calendar. My background is in classics, ancient Greek and Latin. I'm not going to say much more about that. Let's go to the next slide. The Jewish calendar, very important. So Nisan, we have Pesach. Adar, we have Purim. Shvat, we have Tu B'Shvat, which is a more modern holiday for the trees when the sap, starts to brew there. A little Twilight Zone stuff. My grandmother, Zachlon Bacha, I always used to give her on her birthday planting trees in Eretz Yisrael with the Jewish National Fund. And she passed away on Tu B'Shvat. I don't know the coincidence, but it's something to think about. And her yard site is the New Year for trees. The Talmud tractate Rosh Hashana mentioned there are 4 New Years, actually. One of them is the New Year for kings, one for trees, one for the birthday of the world, Rosh Hashana, and one for kings. And then you see the other months, you all know what holidays fall in there. Of course, Tisha B'Av, the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in 586 by the Babylonians and the Romans around 70 CE. We mourn that destruction on Tisha B'Av, but then it's followed, on Tu B'Av with a very wonderful experience of the women would go out dressed in white, and some would say, look to beauty, look to wealth, look to Talmudic scholarship, look to a good family, and they would all be dressed in the same way, and they would find their matches. Now, this is Hillel Hanassi. He was an Amora of the 5th generation in the land of Israel, and he codified or set the Jewish calendar. And there are discussions of this. It appears in the responsive of Rabbi Chai Gaon, written in 992 in the Gaonic time, and Rabbi Abraham Bar Chia in Sefer HaIbor, the Book of Pregnancy. Ibn Ezra later in the Rishon also wrote a work called Sefer HaIbor on the calculations of the calendar, and he brought in algebra, so to speak, and Muslim notions of mathematics. Here is the Jewish calendar of a beautiful representation that notes major fasts, minor fasts. Yom Kippur is going to be a major fast. We call that a white fast. And Tisha B'Av is a black fast, they say, for mourning. That's why Rabbinic Jews tend to wear black, because they're mourning the Beit HaMikdash, Avlei Tzion, and hoping for its rebuilding. And you have other things, Zionist holidays, Yom HaTzmaut. I was in Israel recently, not this year with COVID, but last 2 or 3 years. And at the Kotel, they have the most beautiful davening on Yom HaTzmaut. Rabbinic holidays are in purple, and biblical holidays in blue. Lag BaOmer, let me just say something about that. The Rashbi, Rabbi Bar Yochai, buried in Maron on Lag BaOmer in the summer, is the ascension of the anniversary of the passing of the Rashbi, and there's a lot of celebration there. In the part of the Sefer HaZohar called Idra Zutra, the Rashbi says that he was going to marry the Shekhinah, the female manifestation of Hashem, and he prepared his soul to do so with his disciples around his bed. And it's somewhat like Simchat Torah. He closes the circle and does a lot of mystical activity and so forth in that description in Sefer HaZohar. And let's go to some of the other months. Yom HaTzmaut is an ER, Sivan is Shavuos. Of course, I mentioned the Bikurim are offered then, and we read these Megillas Ruth. In Tisha B'Av is a day of mourning for tragedies in the Jewish calendar. Not only the Beit HaMikdash in 586 and 70 CE were destroyed, but the Crusades and Beitar and burning of the Talmud, and a very important holiday. One day it will be a holiday of celebration. They say B'yamei Mashiach, in the time of the Messiah. Rosh Hashanah with Tishrei is coming up. Yom Kippur, Simchat Torah. Hanukkah is in Kislev and tends to be in the winter. Tu B'Shabbat, we mentioned my grandmother Zachar Levrcha's yard site is then, and I always wondered. I always gave her those receipts of planting trees, and I actually physically planted them in Hadassah Forest and brought them back to her. And Purim, of course, Adar. I was born on Tanis Esther, and they believe Ibn Ezra, a Mukubal and a polymath in mathematics to boot, held that the day in the Jewish calendar that you're born is very significant for your character traits. Here we see some of the Jewish calendars compared to the Gregorian calendar, which is the Christian calendar. That is a solar calendar. The Jewish calendar today is solar, lunar. Solar is both. Let's go to the next slide, please. 21. Here we have in 21. I think this is dealing with the intercalation of the years.
Leap years.
From
leap years. When
the leap years, when you have 2 Adars. If you're interested in that, I have a link in slide 30, which goes into some of the mathematical details of that. We'll go to the next slide, please. The days of the week of the holidays. I just took this from Wikipedia, which is not a scholarly source, but it shows how the rabbis work everything out mathematically. Purim can only fall on a Thursday, Friday, Sunday, or Tuesday, and Pesach on Saturday, Sunday, Tuesday, or Thursday. I'll let you investigate that in my link, which I describe. Is it elementary Watson? There's a lot of mathematics involved in this, and I don't want to bog down in the details and get very technical now. We'll go to the next slide, 23. 12 lunar months alternating between 29 and 30 days. So I should mention that some months have 29 days, some have 30 days. And that can have an impact even for this year with Rosh Hashanah. In the calendar month, only complete days are reckoned and full. Malay months containing 30 and defective Chazer 29 days. The months of Nisan, Sivan, Ab, Tishrei, Shabbat, and in the leap year, Adar 1 are always Malay, and Iyar, Tammuz, Elul, Tevet, and Adar 2 in the leap year are always Chaser, while Cheshvan and Kislev vary. Hence, the common year contains 353, 354, or 355 days, and in the leap year, 383 days and 384 and 385. See my link if you're interested in that, and how Rosh Hashanah is postponed this year actually as well. Let's go to the next slide, 25, please. 12. The Hebrew months are taken from the Babylonian calendar. In fact, I think the Tammuz is like.
Excuse me, David.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt for a second. I have a question about the leap year. How many years is there a leap year in the Jewish calendar, and why do we need to have something called a leap year? Why can't we just have 12 months? Why do we have to have the extra month?
Right, great question. And I should mention, I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is that it's a required adjustment. Realize the addition of an extra month, Adar 2, in each of 7 out of the 19 years that constitute the small or lunar cycle of the moon, called Machazor Katan or Machazor Halavana. In 19 years, the solar cycle exceeds the lunar by about 209 days, which are approximately 7 months. In the time of the Beit HaMikdash, this intercalation was decided upon in the individual years according to the agricultural conditions. For instance, Sanhedrin 2:2 and 11b note that. Later, however, it was fixed to be in the years 3, 6, 8, 11, 14, 17, and 19 of the cycle. So one of the wonderful things I love about Sacha Stern and even Elisheva Carlebach in her recent book on the calendar in modernity is that the calendar measures time. The Jewish calendar is eternal because we dwell poetically in time by observing all these holidays and davening 3 times a day. And if you see a rainbow or if you hear thunder or you see lightning, there's always something to say. So dwelling poetically is a part of a rabbinic construct. But this guy, Sacha Stern, is out of sight. Terrific. And this book can go into much more detail of how the extra Adar or the leap year came into practice in Judaism. And so I would refer you to this text.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add, with your permission, one thing that I know. I believe, this is what I was taught, I believe you add the extra month because the holiday of Passover is supposed to be in a certain time during the year. And if we keep on moving back because of the lunar and the solar years, it's not going to come out in time. So that's why we add the month, and it's always added right before the month of Nisan, which is Passover.
Yes.
That's where we get to Adar.
Thank you, Alita Portnoy. Thank you so much. That's so important to keep in mind, because you can imagine if we observe Pesach and it was like in the winter, it would be off. It's the Hag HaAviv. Yeah, I hear you. I resonate with that. Thank you for definitely adding that.
Thanks a lot.
Essential note. So I've touched on this before. The proof text for why the Jewish calendar begins in the evening at Shkia rather than the Gregorian calendar, which begins at midnight, the day ends at midnight. It comes from the opening of the Babylonian Talmud. Meimatai Karin et Shema Baravin. When do you say the Shema in the evening? Misha Kohanim Nichnasim L'cho Betrumatan. When the priests come in to eat their truma. Ad Sof Hashmara Rishonah, until the end of the first watch of the Levites. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, v'chochamim omrim ad chatzot. So the wise sages, or the chochamim, they say you can say the Shema up to midnight. Rabban Gamliel omer ad shalei amud hashachar, until the dawning, sparkling of the dawn. And then it goes into a case where there was a wedding, Maseh uvahu banav mibeit mishteh. Amru lo karinu et Shema. We didn't say the Shema because we were at this wedding. Amar lahem im lo ala amud hashachar. If it didn't dawn, you're obligated. Chayivim atem nikrot. V'lo zu bilvad amru. Ela kol ma shamru hachamim ad chatzot. Remember, the sages said until midnight, and so they're discussing questions of time. And so fundamental to Judaism is when do you say the Shema? And actually in Masechet Brachot, Rabbi Yeshua said public recitation of the Shema in Mariv was possibly optional, and that offended Rabban Gamliel, who insulted Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabban Gamliel was deposed. Another sage, Rabbi Elazar, was chosen as head of the Sanhedrin because hu hacham hu ashir sar le'Ezra. He was wise, he was wealthy, and he could count his genealogy back to Ezra. But they're arguing over questions of time. And till today, Torah Shabbat continues. When in Kohelet says all rivers flow to the sea, but the sea is not full. One touch on that is that Torah Shavuot Peh is still continuing today. When do you say the Shema if you're in a spaceship and the sun rises every hour? And the text says when you can tell the blue threads from the white threads, but the sun's rising every hour, so like you can tell that every hour. Or you're in Scandinavia when it's dark for months and months. So the rabbis are still today negotiating and debating and having discussions based on the principles of Jewish law over the question of time. And here we have a beautiful piece of art. I thought it was quite beautiful, of the Hebrew calendar, and there's so many wonderful representations in art. If you're interested in art, the library guides at Toro have a section just on Jewish art, and which quite a bit of emphasis is placed on music. You are so blessed to have a rabbi who's not only a Talmid Chacham and really a great sage, but also has a great musical ability. I urge you all to listen to Rabbi Weisblum's tapes. And on the Jewish art section, there's quite a bit on Jewish music. And Rabbi Weisblum, as you know, is a direct descendant of the Noam Elimelech, a Hasidic aspect of Judaism. And there was one Hasidic sage who at Suda Shlishit recited or sang a niggin, and he practiced a technique called going out and not returning. And his soul went on a migration to the seven heavens through that song. And you are so blessed and lucky and privileged to have such a great rabbi and cantor who have beautiful musical abilities. Really, musicologies would be envious. So I mentioned Dr. Stern. I reviewed a book of his called Time and Process in Ancient Judaism, which is a linguistic tour de force. He notes many idioms that refer to time, the time it takes to eat an olive bulk, the time it takes to tevel in a mikveh, the time it takes to do this and that, an Augenblick, harif ayin, and a blink of an eye. Did you know many of the words he points out in the Gemara and the Talmud are Greek words for measuring time? The Greeks were great scientists. So horlogion is a sand clock, clepsydra is a water clock. It's not accidental that Alfred Lord Whitehead, a scientist, a mathematician, said, you can't know something unless you measure it. And yet Judaism has a notion of something even beyond, Mamala Lateva, beyond nature. Brit Milah is a symbol of that, where Moshe lo yinum below yishan arba'im yamim, he didn't eat and he didn't sleep for 40 days and 40 nights. That's beyond measurement. So our tradition, Baruch Hashem, our rabbis are the greatest philosophers and the greatest poets, and we're coming up to the Machzor. Please enjoy the Piyutim, or the prayers that the rabbis wrote, like Rabbi Kalir, Ibn Gabriel, Keter Malchut, Yanai is one of my favorites, and they wrote some awesome poetry, but it's poetry with a theological purpose, as David HaMelech's Tehillim is. I'll end on a joke. There was a Wissenschaftliches Judentum Bewegung scholar, Science of Judaism scholar named Leopold Zunz, and a modern Maskilic poet named Gordon showed up at his doorstep and says, and knocked, and Zunz says, who are you? He says, I'm a Hebrew poet. And Zunz said, well, all the great poetry was written in medieval Spain by Rabbi Yehuda Levy and Ibn Gabriel and many others. So you must be a Gilgal. Rav Sacha Gaon doesn't hold by Gilgalim, but many mystics do. And what you see in this list in the chat group is that I really would say there's a dialectic between rationalists and Mekubalim. If you read some of the articles about Ibn Ezra, he was definitely a Mekubal. The Ramban, who your Rabbi Weisblum wrote a wonderful book on the linguistic codes of the Ramban, was a mystic, was a Mekubal, and has one of the most far out, it'll blow your mind, the Shemitah Halamot, or the sleeping, or the resting of the seven worlds. And it's a mystical conception of time, because calendars measure time. I wanted to give a sense that the Hebrew calendar is eternal. The Rambam's conception of afterlife, the righteous sit with crowns on their heads, enjoying the Ziv Shekhinah, or the manifestation of the female presence of Hashem, and their crowns correspond to the Chokhmah Bina B'das, or the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge gained in this world. And so the rewards are proportional to intellectual virtue for the Rambam as a rationalist. Nachmanides, Ramban, who debated in 1263 and had to flee to Israel when he published the Vikuach, was a mystic, and he has the notion of 7 worlds, which are based on a pasuk in Tehillim that 1,000 years in your sight, O Hashem, are as a watch in the night, which is really a Gemara where it's discussed that each creation day corresponds to 1,000 years. Maimonides, Rambam, the rationalist, says never calculate this. The Mashiach could come in Harif Ayin, a blink of an eye. But Ramban Nachmanides says that it will dawn in 6,000 and set in 7,000. And then he ups the ante and he comes up with there's 7 worlds. So if there's 7 worlds, that means 49,000 years because each world is 7,000 years. Dawning is 6,000, setting in 7. The 50th thousand year of time itself, when time and space will be wrapped up, and mathematicians understand dimensions of time, will be the 50,000th year, which is Shari Bina. But to put it in a nutshell, those are mystical notions as opposed to the Rambam, who has a very rational notion. The Messianic era will be certain political objective criteria where Israel will not be threatened by its neighbors. That is, the Jews, the lambs, will dwell and not be threatened by the wolves, the other nations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of the world will be the Hashem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
to share
Dr.
some
Levy.
thoughts on the calendar and time.
Does anyone have any questions?
If anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself.
I just want to thank Dr. Levy very much. As a matter of fact, that 15 years ago, he wrote on one of my books what is the prefix or something like that. I don't
It was just a historical introduction. The real substance is Rabbi Weisblum, who looks linguistically at the language of Rashi and Ramban. This is the title of the book. I don't know if it's coming up clearly on the screen.
Thank you.
Is it in reverse?
Yes.
That's good.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Any question, please?
A couple of things. In response to what Alita said, we have to adjust the calendar so Pesach falls in the spring and Nisan, Sukkot falls in the fall. The Muslim calendar, a perfect example of not adjusting, is that the Muslim calendar is totally lunar and they do not adjust. So Ramadan falls anytime during the year. It could be in the depths of the winter with 2-foot snowdrifts here, or it could be the height of July, August, like we've had the very hot weather. Dura, Europas, the synagogue was totally destroyed by the Taliban some years back. And what exists now is whatever was rescued by archaeologists from various museums. They have beautiful mosaics, the walls from the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And there's a museum also in Jerusalem called the Hebrew Music Museum, where they have instruments throughout the world. And lastly, there was a book many years ago by Thomas Keneally, The Gift of the Jews. And one of the things he really emphasizes is how the Jews broke the tradition with Abraham of how people thought of time in a circular motion. You went from one thing to the next thing and you repeated everything again. But with Abraham going to God and thinking about things, the Jews broke the idea that time is cyclical. You could break out of it and move on up and move out, because we think of things as in time.
Wow, that's so profound.
So he came up with that. He's a Christian, but he also thought that this is what the Jews brought to the world, the idea of changing how people, the ancient people, thought about time. So that's another, possibility.
Absolutely. Wow. Thank you. That's really insightful. That's incredible. Thank you. We find in Kohelet, Masha Haya Zeh, what was will be. There's this notion of remembering the past, living the present, and trusting in the future. Kohelet Lahavdil doesn't mean, as Nietzsche does, the eternal recurrence of the same. Fashions come back in clothing and things like that. Kohelet's speaking about what you just mentioned, that time is cyclical and linear. Yes, the Nevi'im say that at the end of time, blessings will be abundant, no more famine, no more war, the one preoccupation in the world, no Hashem, like the waters in the sea. All the agricultural laws halachically will be reinstituted, Shemitah and Yovel, the building of the Beit HaMikdash, the reinstitution of the Sanhedrin. There will be a first Rambam mentions in Mishnah Torah and Sefer Shoftim, that's the 14th part of that 14-volume section code, is that the Mashiach will get rid of Amalek. And of course, we remember in Zachor around Purim, the averted Judaicide that was due to the virtue of Esther and Mordecai. So time is cyclical and both linear. It's Kabbalists have represented that in art, actually. Thank you for that wonderful note in the musical sense.
Dr. Levy, I just wanted to add something with regard to when you intercalate an additional month when you have a leap year. As I understand, before Hillel, actually laid out the calendar, is they would determine when Sukkot would fall, and when it fell before the the autumnal equinox, they would intercalate an extra month. That's how they would determine it, because as it would fall back. So if Sukkot for that year fell before the autumnal equinox, they would intercalate an additional month.
Yes, thank you. Hillel, the elder, is very important in fixing this calendar and making sure the Hagim fall in the right season.
We still have a drift, though, a very, very slow drift. There's still a very slow drift, right? Because we had Hanukkah a few years ago, which was around Thanksgiving, was the earliest it will ever be.
Yeah.
Because it's going to keep drifting later and later. Several, I think 80,000 years it'll go through the year, something to that effect. But
wow.
Yeah.
Yes. That was such a special Hanukkah. I think people were, having pictures of turkeys and, in the Hanukkah menorah and things like that. That was really something.
Yeah.
The Tosafot Yom Tov, Rabbi Lippman Heller, they don't eat turkey. They say it's too hard to shecht a turkey. But most Jews will eat turkey, and I am all for secular holidays too, like Thanksgiving. To give thanks. The word Yehudi, Jew, means to give thanks. So I think if there's a secular holiday like Thanksgiving, we really should observe it. When I worked at Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, on the 4th of July, for instance, what Rabbi Tendler Zatal said we had to be thankful for was that we can learn Torah in this wonderful country that allows religious freedom, and we have a lot to be thankful for in that regard. And on 4th of July, they would eat hot dogs and beans, but Torah learning would go on, as it would on Thanksgiving and the New Year, the secular New Year, which they call in the modern Hebrew calendar Sylvester. I want to thank Rabbi Weisblum and certainly Leah Hartman for the chance to offer this riff on time. But if I can just begin and end where I began, Sacha Stern notes that Jews dwell poetically in time, and all the Hagim, which are a circle, and the circle is a sign of perfection, really allow us to do so. The rabbis have divided up our days into davening 3 times corresponding to aspects of the Korbanot and the Beit HaMikdash, and there's a time for everything under the sun within rabbinic hashkafa. As I said, if we hear lightning, hear thunder, or we see lightning, at Har Sinai in Revelation, there's that mixed metaphor where they saw the lightning, they saw the thunder and heard the lightning. Rabbi Isaac Luria, Ha'aria Kodesh, teaches that wonderfully. And that's at the limits of reason. And that's where the Mukubalim take over at the limits of the rationalists. And I want to thank Rabbi Weisblum and, of course, David Salom for the technical orchestration of this, which we should never take for granted, because we live in an age where we've been demystified by technology. And I notice David has a great sense that, we have microwaves and neutrinos and radio waves and television waves. In the Middle Ages, this was the power of the invisible. It's absolutely mysterious. And it's understood from a rationalist framework in science. And yet there's something beyond science. I've recently coming out with a book that will appear. The 8th volume was on essays in the philosophy of science, which is strictly looking at Jewish scientists and from antiquity to the present, up to Einstein, who said God doesn't play dice. And that's exactly why Maimonides' Rambam says that we have to be rationalists openly in the public sphere, because if the world is capricious, as magical practices in ancient Greece going back to Egypt suggest, then there's no moral accountability or ethical responsibility. And that's why rationalism has its place And Rav Soloveitchik would, as the dialectic, make an Aufhebung that both are really within the souls of each Yid, each Jew. The mystical, what he called homo mysticus, and the ish halacha, which is based on reason, and really integrating a harmony, a yin-yang kind of balance between those aspects is a mission of the Jewish people in the search for Chochmah Bina B'das. And one can never know everything. Only Hashem does.
Thank
Hashem
you. That's right. Thank you.